Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation again. Um, Things are moving in the right direction in Latin America now. I'll put it like this. I think we're winning, even though it's tough. It's quite difficult because US imperialism, which is having tremendous crisis, is fighting back and doing damage as much as it can, but we're still defeating them, even though there is damage in the process. In the case, for example, of Peru, where the masses elected a left-wing government, a primary school teacher to be the president from an indigenous background, which is really interesting, in an election that was very hotly contested, that was pretty tight in terms of numbers, in terms of electoral performance. Nevertheless, in the very few days, I think it's about 3 weeks that the government has been in place, it took more than 43 days for the government to be recognized by the institutions and authorities in Peru. In the few days the government has been in place, as number one, abandoned the US-created Lima Group that was designed to overthrow the government of Venezuela and create all conditions to facilitate the possibility of a military or external intervention against Venezuela, against the Bolivarians there. So Peru now is left. So the Lima Group doesn't have Lima to meet in, so they have to find somebody somewhere else, which is quite a big blow. And the second thing that they did was that the government of Peru recognized the Venezuelan government, which the previous government did not recognize because they recognized Juan Guaido. So that's another shift in the right direction. Nevertheless, the foreign minister who was able to introduce these changes has been forced to resign by the huge pressure of the military, the media, and the general right wing, plus the support of US imperialism and imperialism in general. My sense is that the Peruvian government decided not to go for a confrontation on this one, and therefore the foreign minister, who's an excellent guy, a luxury, I think, in my view, was forced to resign and they appointed somebody else. So it's going to be necessary to build some solidarity with Peru as soon as possible. Thankfully, in the UK as well as elsewhere, we have already all the organizations, bodies, mobilizations, social forces, political coalitions, and so on ready, but we need to put it together. That's number one. Number two, which is another important development, is that Mexico, the president of Mexico, the president of Argentina, and the president of Bolivia are working together to ensure that the General Secretary of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, is indicted for having perpetrated, which can only be considered crime against humanity and intervening in the internal affairs of Bolivia by facilitating the conditions that led to the coup d'etat, the overthrow of the government in 2019, allowing a de facto government that lasted 11 months, that caused havoc, perpetrated massacres, persecuted people, and so on. And now Luis Almagro, who was the key legitimating institution for that coup, now he's being very heavily pressurized by these three governments. My understanding is that three governments are going to do two things. Number one, present the charges against Luis Almagro to the International Court. Not necessarily, there are a few international courts, but I think the one where that will be receptive. And he's in trouble. And the foreign minister of Mexico, instructed by the president, has already announced that they're going to get rid of the Organization of American States. They're going to replace it with something else, which is likely to be the Commonwealth of Latin American and Caribbean states, which is what they have already. So this is a huge step forward. The Organization of American States, the OAS, has been the instrument of the United States to organize, to legitimate absolutely every intervention in the region. So this is excellent. Remember, it was the Organization of American States that expelled Cuba back in 1962 because Cuba decided to give itself a Marxist government. And in the statutes of the Organization of American States, this is not a crime. There is no norm that says that you cannot decide what kind of political government you're going to have. Nevertheless, Cuba was expelled. So this is another very important step forward. And the third one, there is plenty more, but I concentrate on these three only because of time. The third one is there will be elections in Venezuela on the 21st of November. What is new about this is the very fact that the extreme right wing of Venezuela has decided to participate, one, in the dialogue that's been sponsored by Mexico, and these conversations have been taking place in Mexico, and they have decided to participate also in the elections. And the real decision-making there that led them to take this position is the US government. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. So what you have really in this dialogue that is taking place between the Venezuelan government and the various right-wing oppositions, because they're very divided, is essentially a conversation between the US government, between the Venezuelan government and the US government. And there is already some hints that are coming through the US political establishment that they might start lifting some of the sanctions against Venezuela. Come the election in November the 21st, every indication signals that the Chavistas are going to win pretty nicely. This is very good because it's democracy, it's discussion, it's dialogue rather than the pressure from the United States to organize some sort of external, obviously military intervention organized by them, which was the previous position. Biden seems to be changing that. I don't have any trust in Biden at all, but I think the pressure of circumstances forced him to do this. So this is going to be an excellent development because once that is the case, once that the elections take place, there is not going to be any reason whatsoever for the United States not to recognize the result of the election. The European Union already has a mission, an electoral mission in Venezuela already. They're going to observe the elections and so on. And the European Union took the decision some months ago to de-recognize Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. In fact, nobody recognizes Guaido anymore, apparently, apart from Colombia, apart from Brazil, Bolsonaro, and almost nobody else. So in that sense, it seems to me that the region is moving towards a very new situation. And there are going to be elections in Nicaragua as well. I don't have the time to go into that, where the FZLN, the Sandinistas, are going to win very clearly. So come next year, and I'll finish with this. Come next year in 2022, we're going to have excellent conditions for the most important, in my view, jewel in the ground, or icing in the cake, which is the elections in Brazil. If Lula, which is a candidate, wins, which is very likely against Bolsonaro, then obviously the region is going to shift quite dramatically because the weight, economic and political weight of Brazil, quite dramatically on our side. And after that, I think we're going to go on the offensive, judging by the calamitous state of US imperialism, showing by the debacle in Afghanistan. I think we have a very good chance to come back to the pink tide that was doing very good things not recently, not very long ago. So I'm very optimistic and very hopeful, but we have to put our contribution towards it. They're going to need all the solidarity that we can muster. So I'll be calling back on to all of you, as well as other people, to help us out, to give solidarity to these people, because there is plenty more to do, such as the situation in Haiti, the situation in Colombia, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Francisco. I'll allow a few questions because there were so many issues raised there instead of leaving it for much later. So if you have a question, if you raise your hand, I think, Steve, you can organize a bit. But there's a question I wanted to put to you, Francisco, which is around the de-recognizing Guaido. And I know that the British recently continue in the law courts to try to hold on to the goal of Venezuela. And I think the latest decision I'd seen was like, they're still preferring Guaido. So has there been any change in the British government position in terms of the $1.5 billion in gold that they hold for Venezuela, which amongst a massive barefaced theft? So any changes there?
No, the UK government is the most recalcitrant one of them all, but they are, from the legal point of view, because the case of the gold has gone through the courts already 3 times. And the first one was won by Guaido. The second one was won by the Venezuelan government. And the third one is they left it, they kick it into long grass, as it were. And the UK government is holding on to the old position by the filth of their fingernails. Legally, this cannot stand. My understanding is, I don't have privy information, but my understanding is the Venezuelan government is waiting its time to make sure that it intensifies the pressure, because the pressure is not only for the 31 tons of gold to be returned to Venezuela, but also there is about $7 billion which is being illegally retained by financial organizations in Europe, plus several companies in the United States that have been illegally confiscated by the Trump government are being disputed, I understand, secretly or sort of discreetly by the Venezuelan government. From their statements, I gauge that they seem to be winning, because legally you cannot sustain. And the reason why I want to justify this last point that I made very briefly, which is this: if you behave in the way they are behaving, or they have behaved with Venezuela by retaining illegally these resources, then the problem is this: they may get away with it, but in terms of the size of the amounts of money being returned, is not much, especially given that there is plenty of years in the future for economic development, investment, and so on. And the position of the dollar is extremely weak. So if the behavior is the way Trump did it, then many countries around the world are going to start pulling out their reserves from US banks and from European banks. And the consequence of this is going to be a massive weakening of the dollar, more than it is already. So from their point of view, it may mean that they maintain some few gains in terms of retaining these resources, but in the medium term, they're going to lose big time, especially now that the geopolitics in the world is being reorganized so intensely, with China emerging as a big power. And therefore, if the United States can retain any position, then they need to actually, how can I put it? They need to save face by allowing the government of Venezuela to recover all its resources. And what we're talking about is something in the region of between $45 to $60 billion, which the Venezuelans will recover. So this is pretty big game. And I think the Venezuelans are playing it absolutely right. No big fuss, slowly, keep the pressure up, mobilize all the institutions that can, particularly the United Nations, but many others, and it looks good.